Else
Realm
Diners.
More than anything else in her life, she wants to see Paris.
Hello, I'm Mark,
And I'm Ruth.
and welcome to the Else Realm Diner. It came from the swirling depths of the multiverse, a sentient cafe, a cosmic mystery, transporting its clientele through all manner of realms. No one knows where the diner came from, and all we know is that it seeks interesting conversation, warm memories, and good banter.
On the menu today is Stephen King, the man, the myth, the legend. So,
The master of horror. Or is he?
yes. Well, I mean, I read through a list of all of the books that he'd published this morning before I started recording this with you. And I was surprised that I had consumed quite so much of his content because he is unusually prolific as authors go. Hence why he has his Stephen King name, but he also has the Richard Bachman books, which was his pen name, which was because his publisher said he couldn't publish that many books.
Okay.
in one go. So he started publishing under a pen name called Richard Bachman. So yeah, he's unusually prolific. He has very interesting method of writing. And I've actually read his book, which is called On Writing, about his methods of writing. So he writes every day. He writes in the morning only. He gets through so many words. There's some very interesting interviews between him and George R.R. Martin on YouTube, because I mean, as writers, they both write these kind of epic things, but George R.R. Martin's method is painfully slow compared to Stephen King's, and they have some quite interesting conversations about the complexities in their works. That's worth having a look at if anybody's interested. So, yeah, I've actually not read all of it, but I have either read and or seen the films or miniseries, because quite a lot of his books have been transformed into films and miniseries. But but also I think Stephen King has had, in terms of his output, an unusual impact on popular culture, in the sense that not many authors' works permeate popular culture in the way that his work does. And so, for example, everybody probably knows about the rabid dog Cujo, but have not seen or read the book. And actually, the word Cujo is synonymous now with rabid dogs. Entirely because of that work.
This is true, yeah. I mean, arguably, it was King's writing of it that cemented the killer clown trope.
I don't think that's arguably. I think there's been studies into that pre his work, his publication. Clowns were seen as funny and harmless. Post his work, they were not. There was some conversations around. So John Wayne Gacy was a serial killer who also dressed up as a clown. But there's been some people investigating what caused the change, and it very much doesn't seem to be the John Wayne Gacy link. It very much seems to be the Stephen King publication of It. Right, okay. And I can tell you, I can say the name Pennywise, and even people who have never seen It, or I mean, that's a lot less than it used to be, because it was released recently, wasn't it, on 2 movies? But people know the term Pennywise. They know that that's an evil clown. And so I think there's lots of elements. Like, I think Christine is one of those things with the talking car. I think everybody knows about Carrie being drenched in blood at the prom. That's been parodied in everything from The Simpsons to, I don't even know, it's pretty much a known
Stranger Things
almost
recently. Stranger Things, yeah.
Yes, you're absolutely right. So that's one of those things that permeates the public understanding, even without people knowing the source material. And I think that's one of the interesting things about King, is that he creates things that kind of transcend the medium in which they were first initially created. The other thing that I think is quite interesting about King is there seems to me kind of to be two sides of his work, and people often have an understanding of what his work is, which is quite different from what it actually is in practice, because people kind of see him as this kind of monster creator, this master of horror, this kind of thing with lots and lots of supernatural elements. But actually, some of his works, like Stand By Me, Misery, The Shawshank Redemption, and Cujo, quite frankly, are all grounded very much in the mundane horror genre, or just a coming of age story.
Yeah. I mean, looking through, so for my part, I'm primarily familiar with aspects of King's work via film, for a couple of different reasons. First of all, I've never really been a great reader for pleasure. I am dyslexic, and so reading tends to be something that I do for serious reasons, or to consume knowledge in that sense. So maybe that's one of the reasons why I've never really dived into King's writing. But looking at a list of the films in particular that have been produced from his work, and as you say, some of the miniseries, it's fascinating to me that Running Man, for example, is a Stephen King film. The fact that that something along the lines of Shawshank Redemption has come out of a short story written by King, but also as well, I mean, you've just touched on it, but Stand By Me is not something that I would have thought of as being King, in so much as I think I've always had this this slightly sort of ephemeral sense of the author and the work that is maybe possibly unfairly something that you pick up at an airport, that's a cheap thrill that will scare you, and that has a certain sort of place in literary history that's going to be inevitably studied, but I wasn't always convinced necessarily that the writing would be great quality. Now I'm talking about this because this is the impression I've gained. That's not necessarily true. I know that's not.
Well, no, but I think that is the impression that I think a lot of people have of King. They think it's kind of pulp, fiction, quickly churned out, not good quality, with some good scary monsters.
Well, the thing is, and yet though, some of the best authors in the genre started precisely there.
Yeah.
H.P. Lovecraft, for example, absolutely was being published literally on pulp paper, terrible quality paper. Some of those early books are very hard to keep, in existence because they're so poorly made. So it's not I'm not doing him down, but I think I've always thought that he's a very accessible author, I guess you could say.
Well, I actually think that's very true. And I think that's actually, I think he is very accessible in writing. I think the way he uses language it means that it's accessible to all. It's not over flowery. It's almost conversational. And I don't know whether that's considered to be great literary art or whatever, but I think in terms of people being able to pick up and read what are quite often substantially large volumes, that is a skill in and of itself. And I do think he has some works that would elevate him into what I would consider to be great literature. I think there's two things he's done. The Stand, which is a story about a pandemic, basically, a virus, or I don't know if it's a virus or bacterium. I think it's a virus, called the people in the novel call Captain Trips, kills the majority of the population, and the people that are left behind are haunted by dreams of kind of good versus evil, and they separate the opposite ends of America. and they kind of are wondering what to do.
Mm-hmm.
It's huge in scope. It's got some brilliant characters in it. I think it's been recognised in some circles. So, like the BBC, at some point, I don't know when, perhaps in the last 10 years ish, released the top 100 books to read, to be considered, you know, literate or well read or whatever it was.
Yeah.
And The Stand was amongst that selection of books. It was the only Stephen King to make it. And I think of his works as I think that as a work to describe the majority of what he's done is brilliant. Now, I showed you the mini-series recently. We watched that together, didn't we?
Yeah. Yeah.
So I'd be interested to hear kind of what you found about that.
Well, I mean, before we go into that, what's the? I'm curious. What's the second piece that you think?
Okay, so the second series is the Dark Tower series,
right? Yeah,
which is a much more in-depth conversation. So I was gonna maybe talk about that.
Yeah.
After we've kind of gone through The Stand, because I would. So just before you talk about the miniseries of The Stand, so there was the miniseries that was released in the 90s, which was a 4-part episode, very similar to the It version from the early 90s, which is the one that we watched. There has been a more recent, I think it was 2019
2020
version. Oh, was it? Sorry.
Yeah.
Version that Amber Heard played a part in, and Whoopi Goldberg. And so that was another more modern adaptation. And Bill Skarsgård, who, I mean, the Skarsgård seem to be going all over the Stephen King stuff at the minute, don't they? So you haven't seen that though, have you?
No, although you keep on saying that we should sit down and compare the two at some point.
I mean, I do think there's a valid. I do think that's interesting, and I do think it's an interesting adaptation. But I don't think it's a patch on the first version. I just really enjoyed the 90s version, and I think this one was a little bit like meh. But yeah, sorry. Tell me what you think about The Stand.
Okay. Well, The Stand, 1994. 6 hours of TV, in fact 6 hours and 1 minute apparently of television, which
it's low budget.
It is low budget, but that's not what I find myself stuttering over, in so much as I found it entertaining. I found it very interesting. I found it to be surprising, certainly, in terms of where the story goes. I love the performance of the actors involved. They're all fantastic. All, it keeps your attention.
Yeah.
But what I found difficult, given that this is a story that starts out in a way that's very similar to The Mist, another story that King wrote, where there's some sort of unknown accident on a military base that the world is changed by. I mean, I think in The Mist it's hinted that perhaps this mist has spread over the entire planet, but we don't know because it's written from the perspective of the characters that we're following. Given that it starts out so grounded and in a place that you can understand, particularly in a time of pandemic that we've lived through, I was very thrown by the introduction of, I think, what I described at the time to you as mysticism. This strange kind of so you start off with like, okay, so this is a biological infection. Is it going to be monsters? Is it going to be zombies? What are we dealing with here? And then out of nowhere it becomes a sort of a fight for the soul of humanity, or the souls of humanity, with lots of Randall Flagg draws on lots of imagery which is very relatable. So, for example, I mean, he wears incredibly tight jeans, for example, and a denim jacket. So he looks very Americana.
Perhaps we should put in at this point, just as a kind of come back to thing, Randall Flagg is actually a villain that appears in multiple of Stephen King's work. So he's being first mentioned here, but let's just notice that name.
Okay.
And then we can come back to it later on. Yeah. Sorry, carry on.
That's okay. Are you saying it's that the Randall Flagg may turn up elsewhere then?
He does. He absolutely does.
But so yeah, so the actor is drawing on that kind of Midwestern sort of Americana kind of look. I think he wears it very well, and he acts in a very charismatic way. So again, I wanted to watch the whole thing, but then he's also drawing on symbolism such as ravens and crows and things, which is very Old Norse. It's also very sort of death. It's very and there are points in the story when he actually looks almost like a demon actually later on in the series. So to balance that out with is it Mother Miranda?
Mother Abigail.
Mother Abigail. So Mother Miranda is from Resident Evil Village, isn't it?
Yes.
So Mother Abigail, Mother Abigail, and what feels sort of like a Judeo-Christian kind of situation, although it's never really, certainly in the series, it wasn't explicit.
No, it's not in the book either. It's just this sort of, this is the good bit.
Yeah.
This is the bad bit.
And she's a sort of prophet, a kind of counter to Randall, although it's strongly implied that she's not as powerful as him. I just found myself a little bit confused. And I mean, I had to just go with it in order to enjoy the series. That's what I found. Because initially, I think had I been watching it on my own and you weren't there going, "What do you think of this?" I might have been like, "I think I'll turn it off now because I'm not." It strayed as far as I was concerned, or as far as I could tell as a first-time viewer from its established genre into something completely different. And what's interesting though is that you sort of said that's kind of the point. King isn't writing about an outbreak, he's writing about humanity.
Yes.
And that when you said that to me, that kind of unlocked other King stuff as well. So things like the Dead Zone.
Yeah.
That kind of thing. But I mean, why did you want to share that with? Because you also shared it with me and with Mrs. Soup as well. What is it about The Stand that you thought was a good starting point in terms of specifically thinking about King? Obviously, I'd watched other King before.
So I think it's got many elements of what King is in a quintessentially in a way that you can kind of manageably take in. So I think it's got the grounded reality, the deep character study.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
I don't think he shies away from the worst of what humanity is. And I think you see that very well in the Stand.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what he quite often does is he blends the mundane, the humble with these big ideas, and in this case it is essentially good versus evil. And I think what was interesting to me is that I had always seen that story as a kind of it was kind of like when human population is destroyed, it's not necessarily that there's an outward good versus evil as is portrayed in that that story, in the sense that we have evil and good almost personified in these two individuals. I very much thought of that as allegorical of an internal struggle of what do humans do when everything goes wrong. And you can choose to remake society in a good way where people are loved and cherished and looked after, or you can choose to make society in a way where people are kind of used, got rid of. And I mean, there's some interesting things in there. So like, I mean, the bad and inverted commas side of the thing is set in Las Vegas, which is, you know, it's synonymous with drug taking, overindulgence. Yes. But actually the people that are drug addicts in that city are in the book crucified. They are drug addicts, anybody that's not pulling their weight, the scourge of society in that sense, people that may need our help are actually murdered and got rid of. So it's not, that side of the world is not what you would think of as indulgence and, you know, not having any responsibility. It's actually far more, you are under a lot more pressure than the other side of the world, where there's the good version, which is where there are people with character flaws like drug taking and things like that, alcoholism. But those people are not destroyed. They are supported, if that makes sense. So I think as well, not only is it this version of good versus bad, I think he messes with that notion of good versus bad.
Yeah, no, I can see that. And also, again, having actually stuck with it and watched it, there are themes of free will. Flag himself actually isn't interested in dominion, but rather in seeing people acting according to his philosophy. I
Yes.
guess, as far as I could tell, anyway. And that's when it became more and more interesting to me. And when actually I thought, okay, now I'll go and watch some other King with that in mind, because actually, when you think about it. And you said, you pointed this out, and you're absolutely right. The Shining isn't actually about the Shining. It's not about the supernatural power that the boy has. It's just that this boy with a supernatural power goes into a hotel that's messing with his dad, and it's about abuse. It's about family issues. It's about the echoes
Isolation.
of the past. Isolation.
And I think the thing about The Shining that makes it very interesting is it isn't any of the supernatural things that actually is causing the danger. It's not the ghosts. It's not The Shining. It's a boy's dad is trying to kill him. And I mean, that is the most horrific thing that most children can imagine, that their primary carers turn against them and try to murder them.
Yeah.
And so all of the rest of that stuff is background, is backdrop, and it's supernatural, but that isn't what is at the heart of that story.
Yeah.
And that's what I kind of think Stephen King does, even when there's very, very so for example, if we look at something like The Green Mile, we have a man called John Coffey who can take away illness, can't he? But he's very simple-minded. He's not very able to articulate himself, and he's often seen as a little bit like the Lenny character in, what's that book called? Of Mice and Men.
Oh yeah.
So like a gentle giant.
Yes.
And you sort of get this kind of impression of him. And he's on death row. And he has this ability, this supernatural ability. But actually, the story is not about his supernatural ability. It's about the question of should we use the death penalty?
Yeah.
Do innocent people get killed? Now, it doesn't matter that he has this supernatural ability. It doesn't. That's kind of not the point. The point is the death penalty appropriate?
Well, and
so you get a very
and arguably his supernatural ability highlights his character, and his character is beautiful, and so in that sense, the risk of the loss of that character, of that man, is highlighting this question, of whether or not the death penalty is appropriate. So is that actually the secret, that King actually sort of has infiltrated people's reading spaces with actually fairly interesting and large questions, but with the veneer of some hammer horror thrills?
Well, Carrie does the same thing, doesn't it? So Carrie is a simple story of an isolated child being bullied. That is a very relatable scenario for most people who've been to school. I mean, even if you weren't badly bullied, there's always altercations with people where you run into people at school because there's so many people where you can't get on with everybody. And I think having that tension around people that you're forced to be in the same space with is something that people can understand. And I think, Carrie's rage that she experiences upon the blood being poured on her at her prom, when she's having this, delightful moment where she thinks she's being accepted, is completely understandable. But because she's got this supernatural power, that rage is manifested in a terrible way. And again, I think it's not the fact that she's got this superpower that makes her relatable. It's the fact that she is isolated at school, troubled, just trying to get by. You know?
Was it you who, or was it our mutual friend Natasha who said that Carrie is like Matilda in that sense?
Oh, that sounds like something Natasha would have said.
I don't know. She might not have done, but yeah, I guess
That's far too captiony. I'm completely attributing that to somebody else, not me.
far too pithy. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, but yeah, as you say, it's Matilda does a similar thing in something. It's telling a very relatable story about a little girl who happens to have special special powers. So, what then are we to make of stories where he's writing about writers, or where he writes about life-altering events that don't have supernatural happenings?
Yeah, so again, I think this is part of the interesting thing. I think the fact that his work includes, I'm just going to list them now, things like Stand By Me, Misery, Cujo, The Shawshank Redemption. I'm just thinking if there's anything else on my list here. That's all I've got on my list here. But those are just, non-supernatural stories, aren't they? And actually, I think that tells us something else about his work. And I think that tells us that actually he's a storyteller, not a genre writer.
Okay. And do you think that maybe writers and writing and the struggles of telling stories is one of his ways into telling a story? So I mean, like, another one would be The Secret Window, for example.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Yes, I forgot that.
Where you have, in a very similar way to The Shining, you have an author who's isolated himself, trying to sort of get over a problem in his life, but also trying to be creative, and out of that comes the drama. I mean, you get the sense that he's experienced this himself, and it's a good jumping off point for a story, perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, I've watched quite a few interviews with Stephen King about that he's given about where some of his ideas have come from. So, for example, The Shining, he said, came from a very real frustration he felt with his son. That at times he was so frustrated with being a dad, he could have killed his son. I mean, I don't know how literally we're to take that, but I know parents' frustration at times is like, oh my God, leave me alone, kind of thing. And
well,
I think
it's the Homer Simpson strangling Bart, isn't it? It's that sort of
yes,
exactly.
Yes. And so that feeling of frustration at being a parent is where The Shining came from. And the Misery story, where there's a character taken from being so he's basically held captive by a super fan, was him exploring his celebrity and the consequence of fame and the negativity that can come along with crazy fandom. But I mean, so things where there's been a writer in the mix has been the main character, the leader of the Losers Club is Bill Denborough, who is a horror writer, which I believe is Stephen King putting himself in that. Misery, obviously, is the writer with dealing with the super fandom. The Secret Window is sort of dealing with plagiarism and persecution-y kind of ideas.
Yeah.
The Shining is a writer being isolated, trying to get some work done under pressure. And this is something that we see over and over again in King, actually, is him inserting the job of the main character to be a writer.
Room 1308, writer.
1408.
1408, sorry. Writer who debunks paranormal hotel stays, but also writes in a cheesy way so people get to have that thrill and and gets it. Basically, he's quite cynical. He's inserted himself into basically the almost the industrial nature of hotels, saying, "Oh, we've got a haunted room," in order to get people to come to the hotel, and then that jumping off point is, oh, what happens when that guy actually is in a haunted hotel room?
Yeah.
But again, it's a writer at the beginning. I think there's a really cool line in the film. I don't know if it's in the book, where Sam Jackson, as the manager of the hotel, says, "Do you drink?" And yeah, could I offer you a drink? And he goes, "Of course I drink. I just told you I'm a writer." So yeah, but also as well, I think from what you've told me in the past, King has suffered with addiction, hasn't he? Alcoholism, yeah.
Yeah, lots of his work was written during a dark period where he was suffering with alcoholism. And I don't know, because there's the other thing is, I think, and maybe this is the point to put it in because it's kind of happened, there's a dark side to Stephen King, where sometimes I think in the books he takes it too far, and you'll often find these elements edited when the work is transformed. So one is the famous scene in It. So if we're not, I'll just briefly summarize it. So it is a story of 7 children who face a demon, well, a creature called It, which turns out to be a supernatural creature. And it kind of lives in the water systems of the make-believe town called Derry that Stephen King writes about. And they then grow up as adults and reface that terrible creature. So when they are children, and we're talking 11-ish, the first time that they face this creature and they're in the sewers, they get lost. And the way that they get over their fear is the 6 boys have sex with the one girl, and it sort of brings them together as a group.
Right.
And it's a highly controversial scene. And King has spoken about it and says that he wanted them to kind of have this coming together moment. I just find this, but I mean, I just find this incredibly challenging, and I wonder if this was as the result of alcoholism, that this sort of didn't seem that extreme to him, maybe, or it was just a bit befuddled in his brain. I find it kind of interesting that that's been left in by editors, to be honest, because it's kind of children having sex with children is a kind of odd, and at 11 as well. I mean, it's just. And not just sex, it's an orgy, basically, isn't it? Like it's an odd choice for an author to make. And you'll notice that in every adaptation that's been made where this scene happens, they do something else. So I think the most common one is they cut their palms of their hands and then hold hands, and this is like a mixing of, like that Blood Brothers kind of thing, which seems far more age appropriate.
Well, and I think it's also, not only is it far more age appropriate, but also it draws on again, it's another sort of American trope, isn't it? This idea of kids thinking that they'll be bonded forever, blood brothers and etc. If they do that, it's it turns up in I think it turns up in things like To Kill a Mockingbird, or people talking about that sort of stuff. So so it's and again, also it fits with that broader element of King being very much an American writer and drawing on Americana in that sense. But that's not what he did. What he did was he wrote a child orgy. Yeah.
Yes. So that's one of the things that I can remember. And the other one off the top of my head comes from The Stand. And I think, so there's 2 published versions of The Stand, and I have actually read them both because not a super fan, but pretty fanish.
You couldn't stand not to.
Hey! Yeah, that's it. So yes, so there's a shorter version and there's a longer version. So I've read both. I think the first version I read was the shortened version, because I think I read it when I was sort of at secondary school, so I'd have been 12 to 14ish. But I've subsequently read the longer version. So there's a scene in there. So there's two people involved. There's a character called the Rat Man, who is shown briefly in the miniseries, isn't he? He's kind of just the Rat Man.
Yep.
Like
yep.
an 80s kind of like weird drug dealery.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yep.
And then there's Trash Can Man, who is the, what's the proper word? He is a pyromaniac, wants to light things together. And on the road, as they are both traveling towards Flag's Las Vegas, they end up together for a little while. And the Rat Man anally rapes Trash Can Man.
Oh, I mean,
with a gun.
Oh God! Sorry. I was like,
yeah, no, it got worse.
Yeah. I was like, I mean, that as a sentence, raping Trash Can Man is weird, but then with a gun, wow. Okay, right. Why? Like, is there a character reason for this?
I mean, yes, in a sense, it shows two things, doesn't it? It shows the Rat Man is bad, like, you know, and it very much paints the Trash Can Man as a like, so it talks about the fact that these kinds, so rapes always happened to him in the past, and he didn't need the gun to be involved in that scenario. He would have submitted, you know, because this had been done to him before. So, I mean, I don't know if you need it. There are other ways you could get that same information around. I find that a very challenging paragraph and a half, in the same way as I find the section in It very challenging. And the thing is, Stephen King is kind of peppered with these moments where you just think, oh my God. And it's some of it's challenging, and you just kind of, and I wonder whether that's helpful to the reader. I mean, those are the two bits that particularly stand out to me, to be like eyes wide, like, so there are other bits that I think happen. So for example, in Misery, the main character is hobbled, isn't he?
Yes.
By the superfan, which, so I think, so there's a difference between the movie and the books. In the book, I believe she cuts off his foot at just above the ankle, whereas I think in the film she breaks both of his ankles in a process called hobbling. So it's a slightly different thing, and that I think is just as extreme as those two instances in It and The Stand, whereas I don't feel that that's an unnecessary part of the story in that instance, because that is showing, you know, an escalation that's kind of been set up. It's believable.
It's also quasi-medical. It makes sense, because how else is she going to continue to restrain this person who's recovering, who almost fully recovered from a car crash? It makes sense. It's horrific, but it makes sense. Yeah.
So I do think that these horrific things happen in the stories, and as I say, they're peppered throughout his, you know, works. But those two instances in It and The Stand, I find particularly just maybe unnecessary, gratuitous. Is that the right word?
Gratuitous, yeah. So
challenging.
But it's interesting, because when you think about creativity, and when you think about an author who spends every day in a world, or trying to create a world, trying to get back into that place and continue it and expand it, there's going to be moments of inspiration which are just weird, and which I imagine most authors, maybe they write something down and then they go, nah, I'll leave that out. But maybe King is interested in taking your hand and taking you to places that are possible, but that are just horrible to think about, or that are uncomfortable to think about. So things like the kids in the sewer, it's it's entirely possible. It's something that can happen in the real world. It's just not something that you want to have described to you in minute detail.
Yeah.
But it therefore, though, it invokes an emotional reaction. It's like, well, it is in that sense. It's art. It is doing something, but it's also extremely controversial. Now, I'm not remotely defending, in that sense, describing an orgy between 11-year-olds in our society as necessary. But I just wonder whether there's an element of sort of shock jock or versions of comedians who do similar things. They will say something to get the "oh" kind of reaction.
Yeah.
Which is also which is part of the repertoire. It's part of the emotional journey that they're taking you on.
Yeah, I mean, as I say, I think this is part of the Stephen King landscape, that there's these places where there's this extreme moment that you sort of do kind of double take at. And I basically think what I'm talking about here really is there's different levels I've handled it emotionally, isn't there? Like the one in, and also I think the thing is the scene with the children in it is kind of there, but you also kind of almost gloss over it. It's a very strange scene. But the one in the stand, it lingers. And that's why I found that, I think, particularly difficult. But yeah, I do think he quite often takes you to a place that's really uncomfortable, including, I think, so sometimes it's characters. So there's an example again from The Stand, which isn't in the miniseries. So one of the characters, called Nick Andros, who is a deaf and dumb character, goes into a pharmacy, and he finds a lady there. Now, in the TV version, they quickly don't get on, and she tries to shoot them and as they run out of town. But in the book, he actually sleeps with her. He has sex with her in the pharmacy. And again, I think that's a challenging moment for me, in the sense that, like, it blurs the lines between what a good character is and what a bad character is. And I think, again, this is one of the things I like about Stephen King. The characters make sometimes bad decisions. It blurs what you think of in terms of it being as straightforward as good versus evil in that book. But there are character flaws, and those character flaws are not left out. They're sometimes grimy. And I do think he does show a part of humanity that is sometimes uncomfortable to look at. But again, I think that keeps his books interesting, and it's interesting that those are quite often the bits of the book that kind of, you go, "Ooh, a bit uncomfortable," but they're also quite often cut out of the adaptations, which I just find as an interesting kind of side note.
Yeah, well, and in that sense, understandably they are, but also at the same time, I think that this might be one of the reasons why, even as a kid who was very tangentially aware that there was an author called Stephen King out there, that there was this kind of danger element to the idea of going and finding his books, that somehow the books were not for you yet.
Oh my God, have I told you the story of what happened to me at school?
No.
Oh, so I was reading, I can't remember if it was The Stand or it, but I was reading one of them, and it was a chunky books. They're all door stoppers, like, and I had squeezed it into my school blazer pocket, so it was like half in, half sticking out, a bit curled because it basically didn't fit. And I was just walking around and reading it because when I used to get into books like that, I would just pick up and read every 10 minutes I had spare everywhere, basically. And it got seen by the deputy head teacher in my very Catholic school. And he pulled me into the office to have a conversation about it, and sort of laid this kind of craziness. Stephen King was in a cult.
Yeah.
He's never been in a cult.
Yeah.
He's got some very strange ideas. Well, that bit's true. They can warp your mind
Yeah.
Genuinely things that were said to me, and that I shouldn't be reading that. At which point, as my precocious arse-holy self teenager's like, my mum says, which she did say, was any reading is good, and if you want to read it, it's fine, which meant I read some very age-inappropriate books as a kid because I liked the cover. But I've challenged through them, but that was the...
Yeah. No, it's interesting because that reminds me of the John Carpenter film In the Mouth of Madness, where you have all these people saying, "Do you read Sutter Kane?" as though the author can is changing the world, subverting the world with his writing in a
So
literal
I haven't
sense.
seen that.
Have you not?
No, I would like to, but I haven't seen it.
Oh, well, you have to. It's hard to get on DVD. I had to buy a Malaysian DVD, which is an English menu and everything, in order to get a copy. It's no longer, I think, in print in America and Europe. So, yeah, we'll have to watch it. So there's that sort of slight sort of, I guess, moral panic. It was very similar in that sense to the ideas of D&D, screwing with people's minds and all this kind of thing. But yet at the same time, incredibly hopeful mini stories have come out of him. I think that The Shawshank Redemption is the greatest film ever made. Won't necessarily know it's a Stephen King story. I learned this because I watched some of the extras, and I think Mark Commode did a documentary on it in the 90s that I watched. But also things like Stand By Me as a coming of age story. Are stories that they flirt with some of these things. So in Shawshank Redemption, there is a very strong indication that Andy Dufresne is quite possibly brutalized by a gang in prison. And obviously in Stand By Me, they're on their way to go and see a dead body. That itself is
The Body is the name of the short story it's based on, actually, The Body.
Oh, is it called The Body? Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. But they are they have helped people come out of deep darknesses themselves. But people often credit Shawshank Redemption with having helped them come out of deep depressions just by watching this story of human survival and transcendence. But is that possibly where some of the power of King lies? Is actually when other people get their hands on his work and they run with it. So Frank Darabont obviously directed Shawshank Redemption. He also directed The Mist as well, actually.
So Stephen King talks about, he always says he starts with character writing. And so one of the criticisms that's been labelled at his works is that quite a lot of the story, maybe even a third of the story, is just, there's no action. It's just character development. And then all the stuff happens in the last 2/3. And there's been criticisms of that maybe being down to bad editing, and that Stephen King is uneditable because of the celebrity around that, and that people will buy his books whatever length they tend to be. But Stephen King has already has commented on the fact that he thinks those bits are the most important.
Right. Yes.
So he thinks the bits that people are whinging about being the character or the meat of the story. And I mean, to be honest, I'm inclined to agree with him in the sense of, like, I don't find his long books boring. I don't find them to be, what they do, quite honestly, is they set up an emotional response later on in the story when those characters have to face hardship, challenges, or death, or whatever it is that they're facing. And actually, so for example, The Stand, some of my favorite parts of that book are actually the council meetings. So weird. But you get this, like, the ad hoc committee is what they call themselves. And it's a group of 7 characters trying to work out laws within this new society. And they're just talking around a table. And there's no action. It's just like, this is what we did before. Should we do this again? We need to sort out these things. How are we going to manage to do that? And that's literally all it is. But actually, I find that to be kind of some of the best bits of the book, where you're sort of like looking at the mundanity that's not a word, but the theory stands. The you know it's almost banal in the fact that not a lot is happening, but it's also so interesting in the sense of like, these are the things, the nitty gritty bits and pieces that you would have to get your head around.
Yeah, so things like, are we going to continue doing a tax system, for example, or
Yeah,
et
well,
cetera,
I
et
mean, they
cetera?
didn't even get to that point. It was more stuff like loads of people will have left their electronics on. Somebody's going to need to go and turn it all off.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
And there's going to be dead bodies in all these houses. We need to bury them or move them out of the way, because otherwise it's going to start being absolutely gross and stinky.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of these kind of,
Okay.
how are we going to do that? Who's going to organize that? Those kinds of things that happen. And then eventually they do start talking about like
Practicality
laws, who's
stuff.
enforcing, so it's, but I genuinely love that section of the book, because it's just like, how are they setting up society? What are the standards that they're upholding? So it's interesting.
The
to me.
standards.
Oh,
That was less good. But but actually, no. That's often actually my favorite part of zombie films. Actually,
yeah,
so Dawn of the Dead. Actually setting up a place to live
yeah,
and
same.
try and thrive and survive. It's interesting that's what stands out to you in terms of King. But coming back to this thing of the movies that have done well, have they done well despite King or because of King?
So my opinion really on this is that the most successful movies or things that have been made as a result of King have not religiously stuck to the source material.
No.
I think that they have transformed it in some way. Whether he's been happy with that or not is, I mean, to be honest, he doesn't really like the transformative element of it quite often. It's kind of very interesting what he chooses to like or not. Because, I mean, he's well known for disliking Kubrick's The Shining. And he actually did make a truer to the book version himself that he directed, that was a TV
Miniseries, yeah.
miniseries. And I don't know if you've seen it, but it's laughably unhorrific.
I've seen bits of it, and the special effects for a start are god awful.
Yeah, but and yes, it is truer to the book, but it hasn't transformed the emotional impact of the book onto the screen, which is what Kubrick's version did. And it gives you a lot of kind of uncomfortable images to look at. You've got that weird dog man thing that just looks like he's giving a blowjob to somebody in a room, and you're like, what the hell?
Yeah.
And so there's a lot, and they took out the hedge monsters, but thank goodness they took out the hedge monsters, because while they worked very well as a kind of scary thing in the book, they are laughable when you put them onto screen, because they just don't work. I mean, so for those people that don't know, the hedge monsters were like topiaried lions and other animals that sort of came to life to hunt and scare Danny, the little boy in the movie or the book. But I mean, I just don't think the hedge monsters transformed. And I think Kubrick's what he took. I mean, so it was interesting as well, because there's the key thing that I think is the difference between the book and the Kubrick movie is the motivation for the father's reason for killing the family. So both of them set up that there has potentially been physical abuse in the past, which was down to Jack Torrance's, the father's, abuse of alcoholism, where he's broken Danny's arm in the past, and that this has been a dark point for the family in the past. So this is already something that is within him. And you've got two things that happen. You've got either the hotel is an evil entity that is causing him to do this, or the the hotel awakens something within him that already exists.
Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And that's a subtle change,
Mm-hmm.
but that makes a difference to how it's presented. And so in a way they're both, so in the book it's far more the hotel is like this evil entity,
Mm-hmm.
and it's doing things to him.
Mm.
Whereas in the film, it's far more like that thing already exists in him.
Yeah, I can see that. But also as well, I think one of the great things about Kubrick's film is that it takes the what's called the liminal nature of the architecture, the fact that these are spaces that are designed to be as
Filled with people.
no, not so much filled with people, but they're designed to be as Edward Norton's character says in Fight Club, single serving spaces. You know, you turn up, you use this room once, then you leave, and for that night it's your home.
Okay.
But then when you leave, it's someone else's home. They're designed to be not to anyone's taste necessarily individually, but to be homely enough that you can be there. Liminal architecture, especially in archaeology and anthropology and also in architectural theory, is often criticized as being one of the problems on, for example, housing estates, where these great big concrete spaces are designed for, quote unquote, a community, but actually they don't service the nature of that community. They say nothing about the people who live there, and they don't really provide for those people's, for those individuals, but also that group's psychological needs and the need to be able to express themselves. And I think Kubrick takes this sort of notion of liminal architecture, and also period kind of, you know, so like the ballroom with its sort of Art Deco, Art Nouveau kind of stuff, and turns it into the equivalent of a labyrinth. I mean, obviously we have the hedge maze outside that Danny in that movie gets one up on his dad in the snow, but the hotel itself takes on that kind of sense of endlessness. Obviously it's not, because there's some wonderful tracking shots that go around corners, and we get
it's
a
also
sense
he's
of
used a special lens, hasn't he, to make it seem ginormous around these very small characters within frames and stuff.
And so I think compared to what I've seen of the miniseries seems just like, actually doesn't seem like the hotel is actually particularly scary. You know, things happen.
Well, I think he filmed it in the actual. I think that was actually filmed in the hotel where it was inspired by.
Yeah.
Because I think it was a hotel he went to at some point. And I think it's the same hotel. I mean, I could be wrong about this, but I'm pretty sure it's the same hotel that's actually filmed in the beginning of Misery.
Right, okay.
So I think this hotel is a real place. And Kubrick kind of transformed it, into this kind of ginormous, like, you as a watcher of that movie, you are not sure how those spaces connect, are you?
No, but and there's some great stuff on YouTube where people point out that actually these places within the hotel.
Oh yes, I've seen that documentary.
Actually,
yeah, because it doesn't work.
So there's a window in the manager's office that looks out onto outside light that shouldn't be there. So. And what it creates, because it's not highlighted as a supernatural element, but what it creates is a sense of unease. You're not quite sure how all these liminal spaces, these work and life and spaces that are designed to embody a sort of a hierarchy of staff, guest, and management, how these spaces actually interact. You do start to feel lost. And in that sense, I guess what I'm saying is that Kubrick was a maestro, absolute master. Well, of course, we all know this, and a master of his medium, of his instrument, of the thing that he was working with. And King seemingly is the same for words.
Yes, but not for filmmaking.
No. Also, not for acting
filmed
either.
it. No, but he just this is the thing I think that makes that TV version very bad, is the fact that none of the finesse that's in none of the expertise about the process of filmmaking is in that. It's just a recording of a story, which is what it is. It's more accurate to the book, but it isn't.
But also Kubrick. The other thing to bear in mind as well, Kubrick, that was very obsessive about detail in a way that King
And
seemingly is as well.
autistic, did you know?
Yeah, exactly. Well, he was
The autistic spectrum disorder.
but also he was almost certainly a genius as well.
Yeah.
He in a literal sort of IQ sense, he I think there's a reason why that film is amazing, and I don't think it's necessarily because of King.
No,
Uh,
but the thing is, so okay, I'm going to slightly argue with that. That film wouldn't be anything if it were not for King.
no, I
So
agree.
he is the foundations
Yeah.
upon which that film was made.
Yes.
And if that book wasn't good or didn't have a good story or characters,
Yeah.
we would not have The Shining, which
It
would be a
wouldn't have
loss, I think.
inspired.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But yes, I don't think Stephen King's input, in fact, into the filmmaking process is always beneficial to the filmmaking process.
No. Well, and actually, when you look at the film Dark Tower, he said, "Oh, I'm really happy with this one," and it's not very good. Not very good.
Well, actually, he said that about a lot of things where he said, this is a really good, I'm really happy with how the people have done this. And then it turns out to be true to something that he wanted as a writer, but it isn't what the audience need or want or makes it good. So that is quite often, and again, I think that's kind of an interesting thing, that the things where it's transformative and does something kind of lifting it to something new is, he doesn't like those.
No, and yet they're often the better
So
movie
this
experience.
seems like, yeah. So let's talk about the Dark Tower, because I think people who've watched that film would not understand the Dark Tower. Because
I'm okay. I'll just say I'm aware of it from its graphic novel and comic releases. I haven't read a lot of them. I've sort of dipped in and out in comic book stores, and what I will say is that I'm excited. I was excited when I watched the film by the concepts on display.
yes,
So I found
Yes.
the gunman fascinating. I found his code intriguing. I found an interconnected hints of an interconnected King universe.
Yep.
Interesting. I even Matthew McConaughey's version of Flag, or whatever he's called in
Randall Flagg, but yeah, RF is what it
RF,
comes out to be.
yeah.
But it's the same. Anything with the initials RF in a King movie is that same character.
So is he still called Flag in Dark Tower? Is he?
At times he is.
Right. Yeah.
He's mostly called
The Man in Black. Yeah.
Yeah.
Even he, I thought, was doing the best he could with what he had in that film. But it felt like that was a movie that should have been designed to be 3 films, and instead, or maybe 2, possibly,
or even a TV series. I mean, I think that film, in all honesty, was not set up for success. So if we talk a little bit about what the Dark Tower series is, it's a 7-book series with, I think, 2 other books that sort of slot in or around it.
right?
And it starts off, it was inspired by a poem. I forget the poem, but it was a poem about the gunslinger cross. It follows the Man in Black or something as the beginning bit. And I actually find the first book is thin and it tells you pretty much nothing of the greatness that is to come. And as far as I'm concerned, you just need to get through it. But it just sets up this character of this gunslinger called Ronan. And then something amazing happens. So this series of books, and this is why it's not possible to do in a single movie, sets up a world that is vast, rich, complex, riddled with, detail and, parallel universes and time loops, and it's and it is just and rich with history and backstory, and that, to my mind, makes it a little bit like like a Lord of the Rings kind of thing, or a Dune, where there's such a rich backdrop that a single film giving a shallow look at that is never going to be able to do it justice.
No.
And they sort of threw you into the middle of this story with no kind of, you know, clue about what was going on. And actually, it's very, and that's why I don't think it works, because I do think the performances of the main characters in that were good. They got the barest essence of what was going on, because you know, there's all these doors and stuff, and it just was a bit. It just was a shit.
I mean, in places it felt like, if you didn't know that this was inspired by a substantial piece of writing, it felt like it was a little bit sort of Stargate, a little bit sort of Haunted House. No, so the House on Haunted Hill, sorry, that kind of thing. And then, but also as well, the fact that they talk about the Shine, this boy having these powers.
Yeah, so this is the interesting thing about the Dark Tower series that transcends it for me as well. Is amongst this 8 series books, some of these books are the long. I think the last one is like, the 7th book, the last big part of the main series is I think possibly one of the longest books he's ever written.
Right.
I mean, it's a huge chunk of writing, and that's saying something for doorstopper books of Stephen King. So in this, he links to it. You go to a place where you go to Derry in multiple kind of versions. You have this character Randall Flagg, who's this kind of Stephen King, the ultimate bad guy, kind of interlacing the story. You go to ulterior dimensions. They actually go and meet Stephen King, the real human being, on a day in his life where I think there's a big accident. He's involved in a car crash or something that really happened in his life. The characters go and meet him, and there's this kind of dual thing happening where he's writing their story and they're talking to him about the story. And I did not know that it was possible to have that sort of thing happen within a story without it just being, you know, like groan-worthy contrived. And it wasn't. It was compelling. It was like, oh my god, this is so great, can't put the book down. And then there's like these characters in it that kind of sound crazy. So there's Charlie the Choo-Choo, who's a train, I think this is in book 4, who riddles, and they have to kind of solve the riddles, which again is very much, you know, the Hobbit with the Gollum kind of riddling kind of game, and it's much more involved in this.
Well, but it's also a little bit like you know, the sentient car, Christine, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah. But for example, in the film, I haven't read the story. In the film, there's a very strong hint that one of the worlds that they're in, or the universes that they're in, might have had a version of Pennywise turn up. There's a fairground.
That's absolutely in the book. There's and quite a lot, because Derry is a made-up town that Stephen King uses as a backdrop to quite a lot of his stories. So it's like a made-up town. It's in It, and it's in other ones. I can't remember off the top of my head what they are, but yeah, there's a book called 11/22/63. Which is about a man who travels back in time to try and stop the assassination of JFK. One of the times that he goes back in time, he meets with Beverly and I think Richie and possibly another one of the Losers Club from It, and they just have a conversation on the street. And it's, you know, there's all these links that happen all the time, actually, within the Stephen King universe, where they go and meet people in different timelines and stuff. And because the Dark Tower is going in and out of different timelines, because there's time loops and, you know, different dimensions where people are being pulled in from one and out, you know, and doors that take you through different places. It's all very interesting. And there's also this thing, there's this number 19 thing, which I don't know if you've heard of, which I think comes up in multiple novels. I think I remember seeing it, but again, I can't remember which one because I've read so many. But there's quite this ongoing theme in the Dark Tower series of things going 19, and it means wrong, bad, off from the desired path. And this is so there's all this terminology in there, and I mean I quite enjoyed that in that sense. And there's kind of characters in there so there's like, one of my favorite characters was this black woman who was in a wheelchair, and she had multiple personalities. And one of the things that they had to do to make her part of the Gunslingers Quartet, which is the name for like the group, was they had to merge those two personalities. They thought they had to destroy one who was this fighter and really vicious, and then the other one was like this really soft, lovely person. And actually what they had to do was sort of bring those two characters together to make her badass but softer. And so there's all this kind of it's so rich and wonderful and epic and sci-fi and fantasy, and I think that's his magnum opus.
So is this a reason why sometimes King can be a bit hard to transfer to film? Is that when I think of his characters, sometimes I think of a character that's hard to pin down. More often than not, actually, it's a character who I'll go, well, you know, these are their defining traits. This is what they care about. But there's always something that either makes you feel a bit uncomfortable, or there's a bit of an unknown about this character. And then you think,
Yes,
almost to the point where you go, I'm not sure I want to hang out with this person, even though they're the hero. And so can you? Is that why sometimes maybe Hollywood comes along and goes, okay, this is a great character. We're just going to make it this is the hero. This is the villain. This is how it's going to work.
yes,
but
I
that's
think
not.
they do kind of. I mean, I think that's one of his complaints, and I think this goes back to me saying earlier that I think Stephen King thinks of himself as a character writer. You know, he writes characters first, and he writes complex characters with sometimes very dark flaws, even if even something like Cujo, which is very challenging, actually. If I just give you the basic rundown. So a lady and her son go to get her car fixed by the local mechanic. It turns out the local mechanic has been killed by their rabid Saint Bernard dog called Cujo, and the dog ravages, like stalks around the car, kills people that try and come in, and she's basically stuck with her young boy, who are in the car, basically overheating and not got enough liquid, and it's quite dangerous. But this is a very challenging book in the sense that in the book, sorry, spoilers, the boy dies.
Right.
In the film adaptation, the boy lives. And the thing is, the mother, knows how serious it is, knows how dangerous it is, but kind of doesn't do anything other than stay in the car until it's too late to save her son.
Right.
You know, and at that point, she takes action. But that's I found that very challenging in the sense that at any point within this story, she could have done what she did, which was basically go out and fight and take risks with her own life to try and save her son.
Yeah.
And she basically didn't do this until it was too late. And it may have been that would have been unsuccessful. Yes, it may have been that it was unsuccessful, but it's so frustrating to like look at what's going on, and her son's getting sicker and sicker, and she sort of just is terrified into inaction. But that in itself is where the fear comes from. It's like, I mean, it's just a horrifying story. But yeah, I found that very challenging.
But also, I mean, how you've just described it, that's another very profound comment on human nature. I mean, arguably, it's one of the reasons why we're in the situation we are internationally with climate change. We don't do things until it's too late. and depending on how quickly we act in the next 10 years or 15 years or so, the ramifications of that inaction will be greater or lesser, and we're going to have to, humanity, are going to have to live with it. Yeah, okay, but also at the same time, there's that. Again, I keep on just coming back to this sense of things being not quite. It's like grasping at smoke. It's like grasping at ideas that that I think are far more fluid and flexible than perhaps we're accustomed to when it comes to I don't know, other popular writers, J.K. Rowling, for example, not without her own flaws, not without her own controversy, in that sense similar to King, I suppose, in some respects.
In terms of popularity, I would say there's a comparison to be drawn there,
Yeah,
isn't there? In terms of that fameness
But-
going on.
but her characters are so crisp by comparison, so well defined, and so often, on the pottermore, etc. So explored or over-explored that, oddly enough, there's not much room for you. This is her idea. This is her work. There's not much room for you to get lost in the themes, and to play with them, I suppose.
Yeah.
And in that sense, having recently watched The Dead Zone, based on your recommendation, I'm fascinated by the character as played by Christopher Walken. That
We should perhaps say what that's about, because it's not a very known film.
no, well, he's a young man, a teacher who goes into a coma, having had a car crash. And seemingly before that car crash, his life was on a particular direction. He was quite enjoying his work. He was almost certainly going to get married to a lovely local lass who he's deeply in love with. But after the coma, he wakes to find not only has the world moved on, it's been a few years, I think.
5, I think, yes.
And his beloved has married someone else. But also he's woken up to find that he has psychic powers, powers that enable him to have sort of precognition, and also I think not only precognition, but also he could reach out to what's happening in the moment as well, can't he? Oh, and also
Yes,
what's happened in the past. So actually, he's
Yes.
just basically massively psychic. And again, what I found interesting about the film was that the character he didn't get the power and then become a superhero. He got the power and then actually became a bit of an arsehole and a bit of a recluse for a while. He was like, no, I don't want to do this. I don't want to because he sees the benefits and the negatives of having this power. He also doesn't want to be dealing with it if he can't be happy. If I can't marry that girl, then why should I help anyone?
But there's also, I think, a question in that it's not straightforward. Like, him having that foreknowledge doesn't necessarily inspire him to act, because there's a question of does acting to change it mean it was definitely going to happen? There's all those kind of like questions where you're like, is doing something to change the future the right moral thing to do?
And spoilers, folks, but by the end of the film, he seems to make the decision that actually being thought of as potentially crazy, but having stopped potentially the end of the world, I'll leave it at that, that actually that is a sacrifice worth making, because he can't prove that he's just stopped the end of the world. But as far as we can tell, as the audience, we're given lots of reason to think that he is correct. That this has been a most incredibly important thing that he's done. But the point being, though, the character is complex and at times unlikable, at times very a little bit petty, or confused and hurt.
Yeah, and he takes you from kind of this kind of regular run-of-the-mill person being just a teacher who's had a horrible accident to an assassin.
Well, to an assassin,
a lone killer, basically.
Yeah, but via just relatable problems. Like his dad is sick. And of course the police want his help in finding a a kidnapping victim or whatever, or a killer.
Mm-hmm.
But again, what's interesting is that what we end up having though is this power is interjected into this human situation, and we end up seeing almost incidentally how it plays out. So the police investigation proceeds as it would have done eventually,
Yep.
probably regardless. It's just that his power speeds it up, you know.
But it's so, again, I think this is one of those stories where like it's kind of like people that do commit murder like that to kill somebody believe they're doing the right thing.
Yeah, or they're so compelled that they simply can't.
And it's like Stephen King manages to take you through to that place where you have sympathy for this character who's doing this terrible thing. You understand their reasonings, and I think that is very dark. You know, and yeah, it's totally understandable what he's doing. You believe in this version, but again, it's like drawing a comparison to the real world. That would be the internal dialogue of a person that would say, for example, try and kill a president.
Exactly. Yeah. That's exactly, in fact, what people who set bombs or who snipe at world leaders would say. I've had a vision, and you know.
Well, yes, or this person is going to destroy the world. I have to.
Yeah.
I have to do this.
Yeah.
And so I find that a very interesting story, but I also think it does speak to ways in which Stephen King talks about a mysticism surrounding death. So I'm going to link this to Pet Sematary a little bit. So in that, in the Dead Zone, he gains this power by nearly being killed. It's this brush with death that enables him to start seeing and having this mysticism around this process of nearly dying. And I think that's kind of starting to talk about King, because he quite often has these kind of things that happen. And Pet Sematary is quite an interesting study in terms of Stephen King's feelings about death.
Is that, sorry, just before you go into that, is that possibly what bothers me and has bothered me, is that King is less interested in the mechanics rather than the effect of something. So he's not interested in actually explaining how so and so gets psychic powers or what that feels like or whatever. But he's in fact interested in the effect of it and what that effect does to the character and what that effect does to the people around them.
Yes, maybe.
Yeah, possibly. Anyway, so go on.
Yeah, so I think Stephen King has talked about Pet Sematary because he thought, and again, I don't know how I know this, but I seem to know this stuff, so let's just go with it. Stephen King's talked about Pet Sematary as being a book so dark he didn't know if it would be published, and it was the darkest subject matter he dealt with to date at that point. And it's about dealing with the death of a child, and what that would do to a person, and what would you do to cope with that. And this is filled with kind of mysticism in a lot of different ways. So you have this idea of the Indian burial ground, which I know it isn't in the book of The Shining, but the hotel is actually, sorry, it is in the book of The Shining. It's not in the movie. The hotel.
It is.
Oh, is it?
Yeah, the manager mentions it. Yeah.
Yeah. So this is something that you see cropping up every so often. This kind of Native American kind of history of the land being something that Stephen King is quite interested in. He has a lot of doesn't explain it, but there's history here. This has left an imprint kind of in the land, and that's got an impact. And so this is this idea of this Indian burial ground. There's also the Wendigo, which I'm not sure where the Wendigo comes from in terms of
American.
Oh, okay. So it's a Native American. I thought it might be, but I wasn't sure. And so we've got this Wendigo kind of creature going on. But again, at the heart of this story is not this mysticism thing. It's how far would you go? How deep is your grief? So just a brief overview of the story for those people that don't know. So Pet Cemetery is about a family who move to a very lovely house near a wood which contains a pet cemetery spelt wrong, which I didn't know for many years because I also have dyslexia.
Yeah. Cemetery with an S. Yep.
Yeah, yes. So it's kind of seen as like this kids' place where they go and bury their pets, and it's also next to a very busy. Well, no, not a busy road. It's a haulage road, so it's not busy. But then the very fast trucks come along every so often, so it's dangerous intermittently.
Yeah.
And the first thing that happens is the pet dies, the cat dies, and the man learns from his kind of neighbor that he can bring the pet back. And you have to, it's not actually in the pet cemetery, it's actually a little bit behind the pet cemetery where this Indian burial ground is, and they go bury the pet there, and the pet comes back. And it's like the cat came back the very next day. But then the cat comes back and is not, it's like a zombie, vicious, hateful, nasty cat that wants to kill people. And it looks kind of like gross and horrible. And so this is how the father knows that they don't come back the same. And this is kind of reminding me of Sometimes They Come Back. That's another one of his things which is similar, this idea of rebirth, but not quite, against the natural order kind of thing. But anyway, aside, so eventually the young boy is killed by a fast moving truck, and the dad knows that death is the natural outcome of this. But he also knows that there's this pet cemetery that he can go and bury his son in, and he will come back. Won't come back the same, won't be nice. It's a stupid idea. But then this is the darkness of grief that he's exploring in this book. That how far will a parent go? Like how dark and deep is the nature of grief for the loss of a young child. And so you have this very disturbing, horrific ending where you've got this kind of toddler zombie coming around and killing. And again, is this allegorical of the feelings around this, the horror of death, so it's very dark stuff he's dealing with there. But I do think there's an ongoing theme of King kind of dealing with death, mystery, and things that goes on in this kind of world that he creates.
Well, but also I suppose the importance of acknowledging, as you say, the death and how it happens is the natural outcome of things that going against that. I mean, obviously, King isn't the only author to have explored that question. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein was obviously a forerunner on that front. But this idea that it's very relatable to want to turn back the clock on death, but that when you do, something goes wrong, something will go wrong, because that's not what's meant to happen. I mean, there's the thing in Pet Sematary that I also find fascinating is the implication of again, almost, I mentioned H.P. Lovecraft earlier, of there being almost an entity behind that place that is drawing dead things to it in order to transform them and maybe populate that world even eventually. I mean, that's actually also a little bit Stranger Things actually as well.
I always wonder if there's something in the sense of like there's this almost this power and the guilt of what the Americans did to the Native Americans, in the sense that there's this kind of retribution almost coming from the land that I feel from King's work. That's kind of how I've read quite a lot of these links.
That's quite powerful actually. Yeah.
because and so I haven't really seen it as kind of an entity. I sort of seen it as this like historical
Injustice.
pushing back, yes, of revisiting the sins on the children, kind of causing havoc, because that has been lost. So I mean, I don't know, but I that's kind of where I've seen this, because as I say, it does come up, this idea of Indian burial ground. It comes up several times in some of his work, which is quite interesting.
It's also probably why it then turns up in things like Scooby-Doo and
Poltergeist.
Poltergeist. Yeah. No, exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
Because I think that's the interesting thing, really, isn't it? Stephen King's brain is able to capture the zeitgeist. Or the zeitgeist is captured by Steve, whichever way around it is. But, you know, these ideas that are, you know, come from him initially, like the idea of a childhood, you know, entertaining figure being terrifying. You know, that's captured the public zeitgeist. And the same has happened with kind of the Carrie being drenched in blood. These things have become, and like, I was watching a YouTube video at some point about words that rhyme that rappers use, and they apparently Cujo and sumo, as in sumo wrestling, are like this pair that always comes together.
Okay.
And I'm thinking that's so interesting, because the Cujo bit is literally from Stephen King, and it's, you know, scary dogs. That's it. Do you know what I mean? So there's so much of what he's done that has kind of left traces on popular culture. That so I think the nature of his like fear-inducing brain is kind of obviously very interesting.
Yeah, and yeah, in that sense, often a surprisingly deep and critical eye when it comes to reflecting the world around us. I suppose a question would be then, how shall we proceed? If I'm going to go away and keep on watching King stuff, should we have another conversation at some point about the films? Should we look a bit more at specifics in terms, so much as I feel as though, and you were saying midway through our recording this afternoon that it feels like we've been talking about King and the nature of Stephen King. Do you want to come back to this? Because I mean, we've said previously, well, you've definitely been aware, it seems, of the fact that you cannot talk about everything in one
no, it's vast. I mean, his output is unusually large, and in that sense, so yeah, I mean, I think it might be interesting to come back and explore some of his works, but I think it might be interesting to explore that maybe with kind of a theme. So for example, maybe we could talk about The Stand individually, because you could watch that mini series and then we could talk about the old one versus the new one. Maybe that would be quite an interesting one. I think it'd be interesting to maybe watch things like talk about Cujo, like what actually happens, and maybe Christine, because they are kind of those, and it, you know, like there's a grouping of movies there and books that have permeated popular culture in a way that some of his other works have not.
Yeah.
I also think looking at his fiction without any supernatural elements is quite telling and quite an interesting thing to have a look at. But yes, I mean, I don't necessarily think we may have more insight into what he's doing as a creator of stuff, but I think it might be more interesting to look at some of the works that have happened as a result of his output into the world.
Okay, that sounds good.
But I think we need a bit more time and a little bit of a gap between now and the next one of this, because I think there is so much, isn't there? And there's so many things that are terrible. I mean, like the Tommyknockers. Terrible.
Yep.
The Langoliers is terrible. But then, and there's a film called Needful Things, which I've watched, and it's terrible, but the story's really good. So I think it's trying to filter a little bit
Yeah. Yeah.
through what is quite a large body of work.
Yeah. No, I think you're right. I think you're right there. Well, do we have any sense of what the next episode might be about?
Yes, I think we do. We talked about this and you clearly can't remember. Chick flicks.
That's it. Brilliant. Yes. I knew that. I knew that. I totally knew that. Yes, chick flicks. That's a great idea. Yeah.
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 And I think everyone's going to be surprised because I am not a fan.
And I
And
am.
Mark is. So we're breaking gender norms.
Brilliant. Okay.
The multiverse calls the diner back into its swirling depths. The warm conversation and cosmic mystery must depart for now. We will materialize again, somewhere new in time and space. But for now, it's goodbye from the Else Realm Diner.
Else Realm Diner.
More than anything else in her life, she wants to see Paris.